So we did just say this was all about hacking, hackathons, but we do want to keep a conversation going with people who are kind of talking about big ideas, important ideas. So we'd like to invite a few speakers onto the stage.
So our moderator will be Kartik Talwar from ETH Global and SV Angel, and deserves a big round of applause for all the work that he's done. If you see him,
way to go, man!
If you see him, say thank you, and everybody else at ETH Global as well. We have Balaji Srinivasan, the CTO of Coinbase, X21.co and Earn.com as well, among many others, and Vitalik Buterin, the founder of Bitcoin Magazine. Welcome.
Thank you.
Test. Okay. So before we start, I'd like to just clarify that I'm not the only one that made this event happen. There's about 100 people, from volunteers to organizers to everybody who supported us. So I think they should get a bigger round of applause than just ETH Global. So we're going to cover a lot of stuff here, everything from kind of high-level thoughts into this ecosystem to going granular into the tech. But let's just start off with something simple. I know you guys have a really good history of meeting a few years ago. Balaji, why don't you tell us about how you met Vitalik initially?
Yeah, sure. So the first time I met Vitalik was actually in late 2013 when I was at Andreessen Horowitz. And at that time, Blockstream, or the ancestors of Blockstream and the ancestors of Ethereum, were actually all co-founders of the same gigantic startup. Most people don't know that Blockstream and Ethereum were once on the same side. There's just a huge conference room with a bunch of people there, and I said, who are the founders? And everybody raised their hand at the same time. And I was like, oh, this is going to be interesting. So that's how I met Vitalik.
Awesome. So we're also going to do a Q&A at the end. And if you have any questions for Vitalik or Balaji, please tweet us at ETH San Francisco, or use the hashtag ETH San Francisco, and we'll kind of moderate and get the questions up at the end. So Vitalik, your title is Chief Scientist of the Ethereum Foundation, or the Ethereum Project, and Balaji, you are the CTO of Coinbase. What is it that you actually do at these organizations? What is kind of your day-to-day look like? What are some of your responsibilities or projects you're involved with? Kind of give us an overview of what you do.
Number one, fundamental research on things like proof-of-stake, sharding, plasma, protocol economics. Number two, helping to kind of go a little further down the pipeline and actually write down the spec. Very often write proof of concept code for kind of testing and proving and simulating different kinds of ideas, or at least writing what would eventually end up kind of becoming the first version of certain pieces of code. Coordinating with and talking to other researchers, kind of participating in the discussion around the Ethereum Foundation and Foundation's overall strategy. Fighting with Bitcoin maximalist trolls on Twitter. Yeah, probably the big ones.
Yeah, so I joined in May, and typically what I do is one part technology, one part management, and I'm trying to, we're driving Coinbase towards a multi-asset or many-asset and many new crypto technology future. And so I'm doing a lot of that. You'll see a bunch of that manifesting on Coinbase, this quarter and in the quarters to come. And a typical day is basically like, can be writing API specs. It can be managing folks. It could be working through all the various legal details to get something new launched.
Great. Kind of taking a step back, how did you initially get involved into the space, and sort of what motivates you and why?
So I first joined the space back in 2011, and I heard about it from my dad, and I actually ignored it because I thought, wait, how can kind of pure bits on a computer that are not backed by anything have value? Then I heard about it again from the internet, and I thought, okay, this might be something that's kind of worth looking into. And I popped into the Bitcoin forums, then comes the story that I already told in many cases many times about starting to write for Bitcoin Weekly, then moving over to Bitcoin Magazine. What interested me about Bitcoin was that it was really a kind of combination of different things that all interested me individually put together. So I was already doing a lot of math and computer science. I was already interested in kind of economic and political topics. I was already kind of interested in open source software and Bitcoin. And at the time, it really was just Bitcoin, kind of was all of these things put together. And it seemed like an idea that was kind of at least interesting enough to kind of be an idea and a community that was interesting enough to at least be worth trying to sink into.
Yeah, so I first heard about Bitcoin, I think, in either 2010 or early 2011, and was following it through the initial bubble and whatnot. And what gave me a lot of faith in it was the technology was awesome, but it was the recovery after that first bubble crash and then comeback over 2012 that made me think, okay, this might have legs not just as a technology but as a market phenomenon. And got very heavily into it late 2012, early 2013. Taught one of the first classes at Stanford on it in early 2013. Actually, a lot of blockchain entrepreneurs came out of that class, and then the whole thing really took off in 2013.
That's great. Kind of just following from that. In 2014, when you thought about working on Ethereum, what was sort of the original vision, and sort of how has that changed so far from your perspective as the years have passed? And Balaji, if you were to comment on that later, how has your perspective still kind of being involved from the early on stages has changed about the ecosystem?
So my vision for Ethereum actually started off being incredibly unambitious, right? Because I was working on this project called Mastercoin, and Mastercoin was this initially this and always this layer 2 system on top of Bitcoin that was trying to expand the utility of the blockchain, going beyond just payments into other use cases, including decentralized exchange, betting, domain name systems, crowdfunding, like different kinds of contracts. And Mastercoin took what I described as the Swiss Army knife approach, where they said, here's 23 use cases. For each use case, let's make a feature, and let's make a protocol with 23 features. And I was kind of hired into this team very briefly, and my immediate approach is, can we try to take some of these features and immediately start generalizing them, right? Can we start, instead of creating 30 features for 30 use cases, come up with single features that can be designed in ways that are kind of more general purpose and abstract and allow a bunch of other sets of use cases. So I started off just kind of generalizing two-party financial contracts. And I basically said, instead of just having one parameter, which is the leverage, you turn it into the whole thing into a mathematical formula. Then from there, I created this white paper that I called Ultimate Scripting. And the idea was basically to replace Mastercoin's entire feature set with this programming language. And I sent this white paper off to the Mastercoin team. And I thought, like, this is obviously such a powerful and amazing and obviously the right way to go. And they said, this looks interesting, but this seems ambitious, and this seems like this will be a very far along step in our roadmap, and maybe we'll get to it in a year. And I'm like, guys, this is like so obviously the thing that you're supposed to do, and you're going to wait an entire year? Well, screw that, I'm going to do it myself. And started doing that, wrote the white paper myself, sent it to 15 people, and kind of Ethereum came out of that. And over time, the vision kind of expanded almost even more with the feedback from other people than out of my own initiative, right? Other people started coming up with ideas, building applications, and I just realized, hey, wait, you can use general purpose blockchains for this other stuff. Hey, wait, you can use general purpose blockchains for this other stuff. And it kind of slowly dawned on, probably both me and the Ethereum community in general, that it really, general purpose blockchains really are general purpose and really are usable for a much wider variety of things than we thought blockchains should be used for back in 2013.
Got anything to add from your perspective of the project from the initial phases? Or do you have any comments to add from kind of your perspective from meeting and learning about the project early on to how you've seen it evolve now?
Yeah, well, in the early days, actually, I remember some of the folks who were working with Vitalik talked about like colored coins, and that was a big thing. And if you Google colored coins, you can see a video from that time period. And now, of course, we would call those tokens. And a lot of the concepts from tokens are similar. So it was interesting to see certain things which couldn't be done on the Bitcoin blockchain. First there was exit in the form of Ethereum, and now there's exit in the form of many other chains. And so a lot of that pent-up innovation has kind of come out over the last year and a half or so.
Got it. What does mainstream adoption mean to you? Where do you think we are in sort of just the adoption curve for cryptocurrencies in general, with Ethereum nearing 4 years, Bitcoin nearing 10 years? Kind of how do you look at that as a broader space?
So, where we are now, I think, is, in tens of millions of users land, right? And there's a difference between that versus hundreds of millions and obviously billions, right? And truly mainstream, probably in the US, would be when we're at hundreds of millions globally, it's probably mainstream in the US. When we're at billions globally, it's mainstream worldwide. I think it gets to mainstream in the US probably over the next decade or so, and might take more like 10 to 20 years for it to get mainstream worldwide. And that's still a very fast growth rate that kind of mirrors kind of the rise of the internet. And that's like one quantitative definition of what mainstream is.
So back in I think 2011 or 2012, I think I either wrote this article or kind of expressed this idea somewhere that I saw 3 possible paths for what at the time was just Bitcoin, where the analogies I made are kind of Esperanto, Linux, and the internet. And Esperanto was this kind of language that a guy named, I think, Ludwig Zamenhof came up with in the 1900s. And he thought that if we create this artificial language, which is kind of completely regular, maximally easy to learn, and it's politically neutral, then we could get the whole world to speak it. But it ended up just never taking off. And, it has a small enthusiast community, but it just never grows at all beyond that. And Linux, there's the joke in the Linux community that the year of Linux on the desktop is always like the current year plus 5 or whatever it is. And, there's the dream, and the dream never ends up being fully realized. But even still, Linux totally survives as a legitimate alternative to kind of more mainstream proprietary operating systems. And it has achieved like extremely real successes in places that it didn't even think of before, like, in mobile through Android and in servers. And so the internet is, Bitcoin is the next great invention since the beginning of the internet itself, and that whole kind of expansionist vision. I would say at this point, we've definitely gotten enough adoption that we're way past the phase where we have to worry about it becoming Esperanto. Whether it looks more like Linux or more like the internet, I think we're definitely still unsure. And it definitely still is one of those kind of time will tell sort of issues. Like, the big question is basically, are there going to be applications that actually do manage to kind of use blockchains and use blockchains kind of front and center in ways that, reach very large numbers of people? And realistically speaking, cryptocurrency is probably still the primary candidate for that, but there are other candidates that are slowly starting to come up. And if anything in that area takes off, then great. But even if it doesn't, the Linux outcome is still, I think, much stronger than anything that any of us were hoping for 5 years ago. And that would basically be a combination of a kind of fairly niche user base for cryptocurrencies, plus blockchains being used to notarize and secure a whole bunch of stuff, being used to improve the transparency of a bunch of mechanisms, doing a bunch of things in the back end, and kind of impacting the lives of billions of people indirectly. So we'll see.
Yeah, so I like that trichotomization of like niche, nerd, next big thing, right? But I would also add maybe to that, Linux, even though it was nerd, it actually did win on the desktop, just the next desktop, right? The mobile desktop, Android, and whatnot. And that's kind of an interesting way of thinking about the emergence of crypto is, like Linux, it's initially a producer technology, right? It's something that makes developers' lives, better. It makes investors' lives better, like power users. And it's actually more useful if you're building a new, financial service, or you're trying to do new things with investing, than it is for the average person. And Linux went through that phase for a long time. It wasn't good for the average person, but it was great for the person who's building Google and Amazon and Facebook and so on. And then eventually it became useful for the average person through Android. And I think that might be an emergence path for how crypto works, where it's useful for all you guys. You can build new products and services with it. And then eventually, just it becomes useful for the average person as it diffuses out from the developers and the producers.
Those are excellent points. I actually emerges with the next question I was going to ask, so I'll just skip that. But kind of just diving a bit deeper into this, kind of with that narrative and sort of these now possibilities, how do you 10x or 100x this ecosystem? Anywhere from technological side to distribution to use cases. How do you think about that?
Sure. So one angle that we're thinking about, there's many, but one angle is there's at least 3 ways to get crypto. You can mine it, you can buy it, you can earn it. And we did the hardest way first, which is setting up mining farms, and then buying came on a little bit later. And I think earning is still something that's open and interesting. And with the acquisition of Earn by Coinbase, we're working on ways to make earning crypto as easy as just like buying it. Just click a button and earn. And if that works, then it would work anywhere there's an internet connection, because you just click a task and make money. So that's one possible approach. There's other approaches as well, which are based around taking all these new coins that are coming out and really stressing the utility, right? Investment is generic, buy, sell, send, receive, but utility is specific. For example, send a shielded transaction with Zcash, or use BAT in your browser, or use rep for something, or use, like ZRX for something. They've got unique things you can do with them. And each of those individual markets and niches, maybe those can be pulled into cryptocurrency as well, because those cryptos end up doing something unique. So that's another approach potentially.
The other suggestion on the market side that I've raised a couple of times is just making it easier for people to buy small amounts of cryptocurrency in corner stores. So just increasing the accessibility of, I want $40 of crypto, just enough to participate in some applications a little bit and pay for a bunch of transaction fees. Because if you don't have even the small amounts of cryptocurrency, then it's hard to participate in public blockchain applications that are even kind of non-financial in nature. On the protocol side, I think solving the scalability challenges is obviously paramount, because otherwise, if the user base goes up by another 10x, then transaction fees are going to be going up to like $5 or $50. And another important thing is usability. And that includes kind of the traditional notion of usability, of making things kind of look and feel user-friendly and intuitive, but also what I call, I don't tend to talk about usability versus security. I talk about usability of security. So how do we make it kind of maximally user-friendly to use coins and to use them, but not kind of accidentally do things or have things happen to you that you really, really don't want, like $100,000 of your money disappearing into a black hole. And if those usability issues can be solved, I think it also cuts down the friction by quite a bit. And I know there are quite a lot of great projects that are starting to work on that.
So I guess to follow on, Balaji, you had a company, Earn.com, that tried being able to kind of monetize users and in emails, and being able to give people cryptocurrencies for the first time as like the first way to acquire them. What are, kind of just expanding on Vitalik's answers on how do you get people to initially own small amounts of cryptocurrencies, what were some of the learnings from doing Earn.com?
Yeah, so we actually, we got the company to like a 10 million run rate before we sold it. What are the learnings on that? Well, in theory, you can do lots and lots of different kinds of tasks, paid tasks. In practice, we found that those tasks that were crypto native in some way were the most popular initially, because that was a community that was familiar with it and that liked accepting crypto. I do think that over time, as we get better at smaller payments, as Vitalik was talking about, as we have more people who are familiar with crypto, it'll become very common to just like, you tweet and you're sending information, or you fave somebody's tweet or whatever, you're sending like a bit of information effectively, but plus a lot of metadata. It'll be very, very common to do these tiny little payments as part of doing other actions within an app, right? So the blockchain is part of it. It's an important part of the app, but it's an enabling part of the app, and there's other stuff around it. And like Earn is like one manifestation of that, but there's others. And so that's one of the things I've thought a lot about.
Do you think a bigger audience for blockchains in general is machine-to-machine payments, or is it broader or bigger on the user side, if that makes sense? The biggest consumers, will they be machines paying machines, or is it humans interacting with machines?
Well, I think it's a completely new thing that you can have machines holding money that like didn't exist before, that you could literally put a private key on a machine and actually have a true intelligent agent that could earn on, you know, on its own and trade on its own. So simply the fact that that's possible is a new thing. I think it'll take a while for the fullness of that to be appreciated, but you know, I know that it's already a subculture. You know, the trading bot subculture. There's all these people who communicate about this stuff. They do these algorithms online, and there's people who do this from college students all the way up to like large hedge funds do this. So there's definitely starting to be that movement. It's hard to say what the percentages will be in the future, though.
Vitalik, if you were to comment on some of the most underrated technological improvements in the Ethereum ecosystem, what would you say some of those things are?
Underrated technological improvements, I would probably say ZK at this point, ZK snarks, and specifically the extent to which you can use ZK snarks already to improve the privacy and scalability of applications. Like there are teams already, like there's the team being led by Barry Whitehead is probably the biggest one, that are trying really hard on making things like privacy-preserving tools for Ethereum, using snarks to create more scalable ways of transaction batching techniques to create more secure and more scalable versions of plasma chains and things like that. So I think there's definitely there's definitely a lot of people that don't appreciate just kind of how close the technology is to reality even already.
Balaji, what would you say are the most overrated parts of the space?
Well, you know, I always respect folks who are working hard and, you know, respect entrepreneurs and so on. I do think that the whole, you know, banking movement of, you know, blockchain, not Bitcoin, and private blockchain and so on, arguably overrated. And, you know, the reason is I think a blockchain without a native digital asset is something which, you know, you lose a lot of the benefits of a blockchain, I believe. And I think, you know, private blockchains may have a V2 where people realize, hey, I'll do a private ICO. It'll be set up as a joint venture where you have 10 companies in a consortium, but they have actually a percentage of the token, and then it actually might work again. But I think the whole concept of blockchain without Bitcoin was a dead end.
A question for both of you: what is your favorite data structure?
Sparse Merkle trees.
Me? I mean, standard binary tree is good. You know, hash map. I use them all. You know.
Great. Vitalik, what is Ethereum 2.0? Just can you kind of go into some details on what it is, why it matters, and
So Ethereum 2.0 is this kind of catch-all term for a combination of different paths toward kind of seriously and fundamentally revamping the Ethereum blockchain that we've been working on over the last few years, where one of those is proof of stake, Casper. One of those is sharding. One of those is the switch from the current EVM, Ethereum virtual machine, to EWASM, the WebAssembly-based one. And one of them is a set of kind of miscellaneous improvements, including things like abstraction, improved protocol economics that I wrote a paper on recently, among other kinds of things like that. And Ethereum 2.0 is basically the kind of new version of Ethereum that will take all of these different improvements and put them together and essentially create what we believe is the best possible design for a general purpose blockchain, given what we know in 2018. And the goal is to kind of have a roadmap to migrate Ethereum over into kind of being that over the next few years.
So could you elaborate a bit more on when and what does that timeline look like, and sort of what goes into determining those things?
Sure. So one of the kind of big things that's made me a lot more optimistic about the whole thing over the last maybe 4 months specifically is that the research side has really kind of congealed and stabilized a huge amount, right? It feels like the research side at this point is like there's no kind of significant unsolved theoretical problems left. It's basically all details and kind of safety checking and verification. And right now, it's basically the kind of a software development slog, right? And we're familiar with software development slogs. So like if you recall Ethereum 1.0, going from the original first step of the Ethereum white paper to Ethereum 1.0 being released altogether took 19 months. And right now, we're actually very significantly ahead of the initial white paper release. So like I would say right now, Ethereum 2.0 and with where the protocol is and where the software development is probably where Ethereum 1.0 was possibly in maybe the fall of 2014. And that means, and there are already, like independent companies, like for example, Prismatic, Lighthouse, Status with Nimbus, and a couple of consensus parity, starting to work on kind of independent implementations of the Casper and sharding spec. And I expect testnets to be coming out fairly soon. And then, we'll have in parallel work happening on testnets and along with formal verification of the protocol, auditing of the protocol, auditing of the code and implementations. And that'll at some point kind of culminate in, like some form of mainnet release. So
just kind of quickly digging into this, what's sort of the rationale behind having other teams work in parallel, and kind of how do you see that versus Ethereum Foundation or the core protocol team also work on the timeline?
Sure. So I think the Ethereum community kind of really strongly believed in this idea of multiple implementations basically since day one. So for those who remember the 2014 to 15 development slog, right, you had Python, Geth, and C++ basically developing the protocol in parallel all the way through with the intention that all three of these implementations would be viable implementations of the protocol that people could run and use. And the goal behind this was a large part of it was political. Like basically, what we perceived as kind of failures of development centralization in the Bitcoin ecosystem that kind of arose from the existence of a single implementation there. Is something that we thought that we wanted to avoid, basically by saying there is no such thing as a reference implementation. And the reference is the protocol, and the protocol is, the yellow paper, and the protocol is distinct from implementations of the protocol. This time around, we're actually going a bit further because there is one version of the protocol which is made by kind of people who are formally hired by the Ethereum Foundation as full-time developers, and that's the Python implementation. But Python is a slow language, and everyone knows that there's plenty of contexts in which Python is just set up that it's just not going to win, right? So it's like and so that kind of naturally sets it up for kind of competition between outside entities to create the clients that people will end up using. And there will be many people that use Python as well, hopefully, but not in every context. And, so the Ethereum Foundation basically gives grants in part, and other companies are giving grants as well so in the case of Status, Nimbus is itself funded by Status's fairly large ICO raise, right? So the goal is to have this kind of robust dynamic community ecosystem. And on top of that, it has this very pragmatic dimension where it insulates the Ethereum community against the risk of any one of these teams failing and any one of these teams just ending up to not being able to figure out how to do software development correctly.
Yeah, one of the things actually that Brian Armstrong and me and Fred Ursum were impressed by Ethereum in the early days was that it did have a protocol spec. It did divide a protocol from a specific implementation. It had multiple implementations. One of the things we've actually been thinking about doing recently is publishing like a Coinbase API standard that would have maybe a similar effect for what we do with security, because not all blockchains provide the ability for you to separate cold storage, signing, and broadcasting, and that's like a critical kind of thing. And there's other kinds of things like how can you do staking, for example, in a way that it's not all with a hot wallet and what have you. So there's aspects of potentially security where we could publish API specs and have people code to them.
So we've already started to receive a lot of questions from the audience. So if you have any other questions, we'll keep ask them on Twitter with the hashtag ETHSanFrancisco. and we'll kind of roll them up in a few minutes. But I'll ask one that I just received, which is kind of for both of you. What do you wish people in this space would stop doing that you constantly see happening a lot?
Just stop fighting online. Build stuff. You know.
I mean, I would edit that slightly to fight online constructively, but and I do think disagreement is important, and proposals need to be criticized, and like I need to be criticized, and Vlad needs to be criticized, and like every single research, like every single idea, regardless of of who it comes from, needs to kind of pass a trial by fire, because ultimately it will pass a trial by fire by people who are much more malevolent than trolls inside the Ethereum community.
That makes sense. Kind of branching off from one of your previous answers, should everything be open source in this space? How do you kind of think about what does it mean to have like the IP kind of advantage to what should be private versus public, and kind of how do you think through that, or how should one think through that in this space?
Well, a possibly perhaps trivial but useful limit case is your private keys are not open source, right? So obviously not everything is going to be open source. You're going to keep something private. And then there's a continuum there between, okay, what is as valuable? What are the crown jewels like your private keys? And what can you put out in public? And one of the awesome things about blockchains is they offer a new way to monetize open source things of all kinds. I think we're going to see blockchain versions of many other kinds of protocols. We've got already blockchain competitors for DNS, but we'll see blockchain competitors for SMTP and other kinds of protocols coming out there. I'm already seeing them. And so I think a larger percentage of open source projects can be monetized. So we'll see a larger percentage of things that will be open source with a blockchain component.
I mean, I would say the general principle is that it's relatively speaking more important to open source things that are closer to the bottom layer and closer to the center, and less important to open source things that are kind of closer to the edges and periphery, and particularly kind of not protocols, but software that participates in protocols. So one trivial example of something where I think the interesting bits will be proprietary pretty much forever is software involved in like market making, arbitrage, and generally participating in financial markets. But the financial market itself being a fully open source decentralized exchange is something that I think is great, right? So like that is just one example of where the core periphery boundary is one good way of thinking about it.
One of the things that's interesting is in this space, people will say, "Oh, you could just take a coin, you could take a chain, you could take a smart contract, and you can just fork it endlessly." And where's the scarcity come in? And related to the concept of do we open source everything? One thing I think is implicit is a lot of the value derives from the backlink structure. Like the reason that when the BCH BTC split, that everything didn't just go to BCH in the same way as to BTC is a lot of things were pointing at the longer chain, right? And so the backlink structure, I think, is something that is a form of scarcity that we don't normally think about, that is distinct from whether the source code is out there in public, is whether things are actually pointing to and trusting that particular database or that particular source code or instantiation.
Got it. I'm also going to start merging in questions that are coming in from the audience, so we'll kind of just have a mix of both versus doing a separate segment on just audience questions. So another interesting question that came up is kind of what do you think are some of the cool things, anything from technological to community, that's happening in other blockchains that Ethereum should adopt?
On the community side, one of the things I love about Zcash is this kind of separation between Zcash Foundation and Zcash Co, and where like Zuko is part of one and not the other, and they have and I think that they've actually done a kind of quite good job of just setting up a community in a way in a way where there is a kind of limited level of influence in kind of both one kind of person and one organization. Another one of the interesting ideas that I think Zuko came up with is this idea that practical control over protocol development and control over trademark ownership should be maximally separate. And that's, I think, an interesting idea that probably in Ethereum and probably other public blockchains should consider adopting, because unfortunately there isn't really a good way to kind of have a trademark not be owned by anyone. But this does seem like a kind of pragmatic approach that does kind of minimize the centralization harm that can come out of that issue particularly.
Balaji, I guess to add on to that, what are some of the technological advancements that you're tracking personally outside of what's going on at Coinbase?
Well, certainly we're looking at all the privacy coin related stuff, ZK snarks, Starks, bulletproofs. We are, I can't talk about everything we're looking at, but, we're obviously aware of, stable coins. We're aware of, what's going on with, like things like token curated registries. We pay attention to a lot of the stuff, but the thing is Coinbase's role is sort of to mainstream blockchain, which means that by necessity, we're not on the cutting edge, right? Like if something is truly on the cutting edge, if it's on the bleeding edge, it's not really ready for tens of millions of users typically. So we try to, do what Apple does, which is take a technology that's in its spring and it's proven itself a bit, and it's not going to have like a CVE on day one. And when it's ready for getting to tens of millions of users, then we'll mainstream it. So those are kinds of things that we're looking at.
This is a really good segue into our next part, which is we're going to steal the underrated or overrated segment from Tyler Cowen's podcast. So I'll name a handful of topics, and the way you kind of play this is you have to say, is it underrated or overrated, and a quick answer on why. So we'll start off with ZK snarks.
I'd say about correctly rated at this point. Like, they are very powerful, and I think general purpose privacy or general purpose zero knowledge proofs is like a really huge advancement in cryptography, right? Because if you look, I was barely following cryptography maybe 10 to 15 years ago, back when zero knowledge proofs were this kind of application specific protocol, and you had to come up with specific protocols for specific use cases, and it was like super lame. And now it's the fact that we're fairly close to the point where you can make privacy preserving protocols for just very large classes of things involving just abstract programming languages is huge. And I do think that the community recognizes that.
Underrated or overrated? ZK snarks or Starks?
Well, I think ZK snarks are still underrated. People in this audience know what they are, but after Sapling, comes out in a few weeks, I think it just gets mainstream to a much greater extent, and we haven't even yet explored where it's going to get. And then with Starks and bulletproofs, I think it's going to go to the next level because we eliminate the trusted setup, and we have even faster transactions and possibly smaller, proof sizes. So I think all those technologies are underrated relative to what the general population knows about them.
Non-fungible tokens, underrated or overrated?
On the margin, I'd say overrated. It's, I don't know, I'm like suspicious of things that get too buzzwordy. So I throw token curated registries in the same bucket.
I guess we'll skip the next question.
Yeah, I'm an investor in CryptoKitties. I do think that in the long term, NFTs will be important. I think like today, if you go and look at DApp Radar, there's not a lot of volume in buying and selling collectibles and NFTs. But I do think that as they start getting hooked into video games and there are the backends for things like their potions and swords within video games, I think that's going to be the thing that pulls them up in the medium term. So overrated maybe today, but underrated in the long term. And eventually we'll get, what people have always talked about, blockchain real estate and so on. But it'll take a while.
What about stablecoins?
Globally speaking, I'd say underrated. I still think people and a lot of people don't realize the extent to which stablecoins solve one of people's biggest concerns with the with the cryptocurrency space, which is that in order to use these applications, you have to expose themselves to volatility. And with stable coins, a lot of that goes away, and you can actually use applications that just look like regular applications involving dollars. And I'm also, very happy that very recently it seems like there was this big outburst of kind of new stablecoin companies coming along. Like there's Circle's announcements. There's, like True USD. There's like in Crypto DT over there's I forget. There's like there's a bunch of them now, right? And that means, like, first of all, it's nice to see that there's more. It's nice to see that these new ones are kind of more, more reputable and audited and so forth than the ones that came before. And it's, I'm also very happy to see that, MakerDAO and DAI is kind of doing well and continuing to prove itself and holding its value despite, like overseeing ETH dropping in price by more than 80%. I think it's still a very an impressive accomplishment for a crypto-backed stablecoin to stay stable through that period. And in the long run, these kinds of tokens are a kind of way for traditional financial systems to kind of upload themselves to crypto land if they want to.
Yeah, I would say stablecoins are underrated today. For a couple of reasons. But with that said, I distinguish between two kinds of stablecoins at least. There's multiple kinds, but I'd say there's one class of stablecoins that I'm somewhat bearish on, and those I'd consider the Rube Goldberg machines, smart contract things that try to manufacture a stable result out of a fundamentally unstable underlying digital currency, I would argue. And then by contrast, there are the ones which I'd call, let's say, audit-heavy tech-light stablecoins, where really what they're selling is trust. The trust that you can go and redeem it for good old-fashioned US dollars or whatever fiat currency underneath. And those I'm more bullish on because I think those are actually what people really want with a stablecoin is they want the trust of redemption, which means stablecoins are more like an insurance business than like other kinds of crypto businesses because it's a question of what is the risk that I won't be able to redeem something. If you can solve those problems and if you can have a stablecoin that people really trust and that doesn't have redemption risk, then I think in the medium term we'll think of, like fintech before stablecoin is like mobile before iPhone, in the sense that every fintech company, if you could just have a digital dollar, a blockchain-based dollar, if you didn't need to do a banking partnership or something like that, you just go and program right away with a digital dollar based on the blockchain. And I think that's a really important medium-term thing that could happen if we get a working and functional stablecoin.
I think one important point in favor of crypto-backed to Ruby Goldberg machine stablecoins is that they're more likely to survive an unfriendly regulatory and banking environment.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I think if you're trying to fundamentally represent a U.S. dollar, I think you can't, avoid the question of interfacing with the U.S. banking and regulatory system. It's kind of like this: if you had an app that got popular enough on Facebook's platform, eventually Facebook will knock on your door, right? Mm-hmm. And if you have something which is representing hundreds of billions of dollars, eventually, there will be some nexus to the U.S. government and so on. It's just like, it's kind of inevitable. So that's kind of a fundamental premise, and we could disagree on that.
Mm-hmm. Kind of on that note, how do you look at decentralized organizations? Overrated or underrated?
I would probably say is somewhat overrated in the especially in the short term. And part of and I will, this is definitely a change in opinion. I was kind of more idealistic about this subset of the space maybe 3 or 4 years ago. I think the problem is that, like, first of all, if you try to create complete decentralized organizations, there's just game theoretic issues and misalignments in pretty much every kind of governance that you can come up with. But also, I think a lot of the value that doesn't necessarily needs to come from kind of fully fledged, decentralized corporations in the sky running on the blockchain. It can come from incentive alignments that come out of kind of smaller and more purpose-specific gadgets. So like the kind of DAICO that I came up with at the end of last year is probably one example of that. I mean, things like assurance contracts, things like different kinds of like public good funding mechanisms, different kinds of like quadratic voting gadgets or whatever. I think kind of more self-contained things like that are where you can kind of see more kind of stable and realistic value in the short term.
Yeah, so I'm bullish on DOs, very bearish on DAOs. Like I don't believe in the autonomous aspect for a while. And why bullish on DOs? Well, I think we have more and more teams that are remote work based in multiple jurisdictions, and I think in the not too distant future, quote, incorporating or signing contracts on the Ethereum blockchain or other blockchains like that, smart contract based blockchains. Is going to become pretty popular for remote teams. And you can imagine like a blockchain-based Slack or a blockchain DocuSign, a BlockySign that just allows these quote decentralized organizations to agree on something, vote, and then allocate funds, with a proof of stake vote or some other kind of vote, just even a multi-sig kind of vote. And I think that's kind of cool, where you don't necessarily need to take the entire DAO concept. You can take pieces of it and just be like, oh, here's how, we get multi-sig, for 3 people who live in 3 different countries under 3 different legal systems. We don't have to have them incorporated in Delaware. We can have something on the blockchain that's pretty lightweight. I think I'm bullish on that kind of thing.
We'll do like one last one on overrated, underrated. Off-chain scaling. What are your thoughts on that?
So I'm actually, I really believe off-chain is very underrated in the sense of, for most applications, unless you're Vitalik, unless you're Zuko, unless you're somebody who's a cryptographer or a very knows systems programming and so on, most people aren't going to be able to do that. And instead, they should keep most of their state in a normal Postgres database and have blockchain functionality, right? So blockchain, like the blockchain will provide balances, it'll provide addresses, your users can send and receive funds, and you can keep your images and your normal user data or whatever in Postgres, like a normal kind of thing. And so then your app has, quote, 2 data stores. It's got Postgres and it's got, the blockchain, over here. And I think that kind of model is going to be like a pretty important one, a hybrid model. And moreover, anything that you can do off-chain, you should do off-chain, because the blockchains are relatively low capacity right now. You want to batch transactions, you don't want to pay fees, you want to try to do as much as you can off-chain and then just write the absolute minimal digest on-chain. So I think that's going to be a bigger and bigger thing. One thing I wrote about 2 years ago that I'd love to see, maybe somebody here can hack it tonight, is something similar to PostGIS, right? So PostGIS is basically a set of add-ons for Postgres that adds, range queries, XY, latitude, longitude support to Postgres, which is normally just a standard relational database. I'd love to see a post chain that does the same kind of thing, but adds blockchain functionality. So it makes it easy to ingest a blockchain, do relational queries, to search and sort blockchain-based data structures, and an add-on like that. And that's the kind of thing I think would help a lot, where you're doing a lot of stuff off-chain and then you have a digest that is written to the blockchain and it costs you something. I think that's going to be an important paradigm.
We'll move on to sort of the next couple of questions we've gotten in. Vitalik, what role has threshold relay and other improvements from the Dfinity ecosystem have played into the design of Ethereum 2.0?
So we're not using threshold relays specifically, and both because we prefer being leaner on cryptographic assumptions, and also because just to kind of dial back a bit, right? Well, threshold relay is this kind of in-block. Well, it's 2 things. One is it's a consensus algorithm, and 2, it's a in-blockchain random number generator, and it relies pretty heavily on kind of BLS signatures and distributed key generation. And I personally dislike distributed key generation because it's this like big extra load of cruft that you have to add into the protocol spec somewhere. And we're taking a somewhat different approach where we use BLS signature aggregation, which also uses BLS signatures and also gets kind of very high efficiencies from combining signatures together in the same way a threshold relay does. But we use this in combination with a different kind of proof of stake algorithm that uses a ghost-based fork choice rule. And I mean, this is nice, and the goal that we're targeting is actually, we do not want the security of the blockchain to be fully dependent on the security of a random number generator algorithm, right? Like we want to be able to prove that the blockchain is secure even if the attacker chooses what all the random numbers are. And surprisingly enough, with a blockchain algorithm where you have enough validators participating at the same time, you can actually do that. Then for a random number generator, we have Justin's entire line into VDF research. And while that's technically not necessary for the blockchain to work, that does kind of increase the security margin of the system. So it decreases the minimum safe committee size, for example, by maybe a factor of 2 or 3 in practice. And it increases the safety tolerances by a few percent. And at the same time, random numbers are something that's useful to a wide array of layer 2 applications. And so that we are building in a random beacon in chain, but we are using verifiable delay functions instead of verifiable random functions. So it's somewhat different technology.
Balaji, a question for you from the audience. What geographies will we first see a mass adoption in terms of a use case for cryptocurrencies, and sort of why is that the case, or will that be the case?
That's a great question. There is a thesis that it's going to be like the Venezuelas of the world and so on, where cryptocurrency has mass adoption. I actually, as sympathetic as I am to the Venezuelan people, and as much as I do believe that does illustrate an important use case for Bitcoin, I do think that cryptocurrency is probably going to have to prove itself in the developed world first, and then it will filter out to everywhere else. And the reason for that is any technology in the early stages has bugs and horrible UX and various shortcomings that only relatively wealthy people who have the time and the energy and don't have a chaotic situation around them, and they have good internet and they can download a multi-gigabyte blockchain and they don't have a light wallet, all that type of stuff. Only folks who have all of that, time and internet, I think are going to get this thing off the ground, and then eventually get it to hundreds of millions and then get to billions. And I think it'll have a similar emergence mode to smartphones, where the developed world subsidized them and got them to scale, and then they were cheap enough for the developing world to buy into them. So I'm a huge long-term bull on banking the unbanked with crypto and so on. I do believe that eventually does happen. I just don't think that's where it starts.
Yeah, and I'd probably generally agree. I'd say while we're in the enthusiast phase, it'll continue to be the case that the map of where the blockchain nodes are will roughly track the map of where the brightest night lights are if you look at the Earth from space. But in the long term, I definitely do, and I also agree that banking the unbanked, kind of improving financial systems in cases where kind of cross-national kind of cooperation is currently weakest, and where existing governance structures are weakest and most hostile is one of the most interesting areas where they can be applied as well.
So in the interest of time, we'll just ask 2 more questions. One, just to kind of come back to something that was said earlier, Coinbase is involved with GridCrypto.org, and the Ethereum Foundation is involved with the grant program. How can others get involved with these initiatives?
Yeah, so we have a charitable arm called GiveCrypto.org. Give Crypto is just spelled like that. That Brian set up, and that does charitable work in the space.
So for the Ethereum Foundation grant program, I mean, there's 2 ways to participate, right? One is to apply for a grant, and the other is if you have a lot of money, then you yourself can just become a grant-giving body, and you can either decide whom to give grants to yourself, or you can kind of piggyback onto who the Ethereum Foundation gives money yourself, because those lists are completely public. So either of those 2 is highly welcome, and we're on the project side, we're actively looking for projects, so doing work in scalability, particularly usability, including what I call usability of security, and that includes both the wallet and the kind of smart contract programming side. Including things like formal verification. It includes layer 2 systems of pretty much every kind. So it's if you wants to build a piece of the Ethereum ecosystem, the opportunity and kind of do that as a full-time thing, the opportunity is there for you.
And lastly, Balaji already answered what he would like to hack on potentially this weekend. What would you make if you were a hacker at this event?
Well, FOMO 3D was pretty awesome. So, something like that, I think really is, it just is something you could only do on the blockchain, So I'd love to see stuff like that, which I think push the limits of what you can do with smart contracts. I'd love to see something like post-chain, what I just talked about. I think that'd be very useful. Yeah, I mean, those two in particular, I think would be cool.
Reputation systems are probably still kind of an interesting area that we probably haven't. There was a lot of enthusiasm back in 2014, but then it kind of petered off. And I think we might be at the point where the infrastructure is there to kind of make another go at that whole area. I would also say kind of privacy preserving applications are in general are an interesting category. Anything kind of any kind of developer middleware, and particularly kind of more possibly decentralized alternatives to existing kind of more centralized forms of middleware. Solutions in wallets and security solutions, another important area. Like basically and also in general, just look at kind of what you think are pain points that are seen by kind of developers in the ecosystem and try to have a go at solving any of them.
Perfect. Well, Balaji, Vitalik, thank you so much for taking out the time to share your views with us tonight, and wish all of them the best for hacking.